little something to say about such things. So hi Debbie and David and Joel. Welcome. This week is a double parsha, and it's a mouthful. Acharei-Kedoshim. So Acharei already sounds like it's a double parsha, but that's the first part, meaning after the death. So it picks up, it kind of like, it's like if you had a TV show that followed like two separate storylines, you know, and the last episode followed a separate storyline. So now this parsha has to be like, anyway, back to our first character. So, you know, we're back to Aaron and the goings on in the tent of meeting after the death of his sons. So it picks up there. We get the description of the scapegoat procedure for Yom Kippur. Excuse me, some other rules around Yom Kippur, and sacrifice procedures for the holy days. Then the whole list of sex laws that are traditionally read on Yom Kippur afternoon. In the Reform movement, we don't read that part, but it's, you know, there's a mix of stuff happening there. Some of it is good sense, and some of it doesn't follow our progressive views anymore of appropriate relationships, or what constitutes an inappropriate relationship. The rules against shotness and crossbreeding animals comes up here, which is interesting and weird, and like there's just like a whole list of things. And then, oh, sorry. So between the sex laws and then the shotness, that's where we switch into the second parsha of the double portion of this week. Kedoshim. Kedoshim is one of my favorite parshiot, especially among the non-narrative ones. There's just so much richness here. And here's where I think it connects to what David and I were just talking about on justice issues. You know, it has the law against standing idly by the blood of your neighbor. Don't, you know, that every law must be applied equally to all, that like you can't, you know, you can't give favor to some or others, you know, that it all, you know, it has to be fair. You know, and such things. And then again, like then there's some kind of random assortment of laws that like I think are very interesting in proximity to each other. They don't seem to have a whole lot to do with each other, but they like I think we could tease out some connections to this listing of like, you know, don't make fun of disabled people, don't tattoo yourself, don't be a prostitute or a witch. Like there's just there's a weird sequence of things, but I think there's something to that list that's interesting to me that we could tease out together as well. And then the parsha closes with some consequences for breaking these laws, vaguely, and then it ends with you shall be holy, for I the Lord your God am holy, which I just think is like one of the greatest lines in all of Torah. That you know, and there's several great lines in Torah, and in this parsha along those lines, but that one, I don't know, I love this idea that like as people who hold to Torah, we are called to this like divine level of behavior, and that like that's what it means to see every person in the divine image is to understand that like we are all holding ourselves and each other to that holy level, like to be godlike, not in a megalomaniac sense, but in a in a benevolent sense, and that, and then that's what it means to be someone who follows Torah, is to try to to be at that level of holiness and goodness to others, and fairness and love for all. And that love does not mean blind kindness either. Sometimes love means also reprimanding and calling out injustice and those things too. So that's the summary. Is there any place in particular that folks want to start? Questions or specific verses that jumped out at you? No? Okay, Dave.
Gotta unmute.
Wait, you just remuted. There you go.
Yep. Verse 8, verse 16, line 8, or chapter
16, verse 8.
Verse 8.
Yeah.
Azazel. Safaria seems to say just that's what it is. And then when I went to Chabad, it was translated as mountain, a steep, this mountain that I'm guessing the goat was to be thrown over. And I'm thinking that doesn't really quite make sense, because if the people are going to be moving, or they're going to be in Jerusalem in the temple, I thought, I don't. So what? And then when I read it, it almost seemed like, a stand-in for the devil. That this is for God and this is for the devil. And I thought that doesn't make sense either. So what is it?
Well, okay, so the devil is like, that's a big conversation of what that even means in Judaism. But yes, those are the two main schools of thought, I would say, in the Parshanut, in the commentaries about this verse. Azazel is either the part of the desert that the goat is to be killed on. I don't know that I've heard that it's the mountain itself that the goat is pushed off of, but it's the part of but it's like a stand-in for wilderness, of like that he will be sent out of our camp, like that he will go away into Azazel, whatever that emptiness means, or like sacrifice to a demon of some sort. And in like later, much later, medieval Jewish demonology, there is a demon called Azazel, and he's a goat demon. He's got ram horns. So that's sort of the sense of it. We don't know. But yes, I would say, I think the most common like normative view is that it refers to the piece of the wilderness, that like at the time of Aaron, it probably was a specific place in the desert known as Azazel. But then as you say, when they moved into Jerusalem and this sacrifice was still enacted in the days of the temple, more or less, they went out to an uninhabited piece of the desert. They didn't have to like find the exact spot on the other side of the Jordan again or whatever, but just to find a place that you could send the goat out to die, and to take the sins of the people away from civilization. But I do kind of like the idea of the Azazel goat demon also. But that's like a pretty, I don't know how widely held that is. That's, there, I feel like there was a very specific time in history that Jewish demonology was followed. And then, and now it's only horror nerds like me that still read about that stuff. Folklore, exactly. But there's already so much mythos in our holy text that I don't know how much people really need that kind of folklore. Most people or are not comfortable necessarily fusing something that we accept as completely lore with something that we want to believe has some basis in reality and is divine, so it gets separated out more. But there was that period in the like 14th century ish that demonology was hot. So yeah, anyway.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I mean, it also just like look at the Hebrew for it. Azazel has such a like sinister feel to it, I don't know. I feel like those Zions like they're sharp, like the cliffs at the cliff edge that the goat bounces off of as it tumbles to its death. And of course, this ritual is where the term scapegoating comes from, which is, interesting that it comes from Torah and then has been applied disproportionately to Jews over the millennia. But,
Yes, I was going to ask about 19.19, basically forbidding mixing of things like 2 different kinds of cattle or 2 different kinds of seed in a field. When it said you shall not put on cloth from a mixture of 2 kinds of material, when they say cloth, are they talking about all clothing or just your top, and does it include shoes? And then how do those who strictly follow the rules, among the strict Orthodox perhaps, follow that, especially with shoes these days?
It doesn't, I mean, I'm trying to look at the Hebrew itself. We'll get to Molech in a minute, Brandy. Okay, yeah, it does just say shotness. Okay, so it refers pretty specifically to the wool and linen thing. So the shoes being made of leather or synthetic material is immaterial. Like even back then, they would have had either linen or wool clothing and leather sandals, strappy things to keep their feet together. So yeah, it's not just any 2 materials, although I can see how that translation is kind of vague and makes it sound like that, but it means specifically like woven materials.
So today's blended cotton, polyester, or whatever.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's part of why the Haredi continued to dress like 19th century Polish noblemen, is because they at least know that, clothing of that era were made of one material. So, they wear their wool suits all through the summer and whatever, because it's one woven thing. But the shoes are separate. It's not, it's not a concern.
Okay.
I mean, not just because they're a separate article of clothing, but because the materials are not a type of material that is of concern. Joel?
Yes, has anyone here heard of Lindsay Woolsey from grammar school or maybe high school? Lindsay Woolsey, an American culture, that's it. It's linen and wool, and it's very easy to manufacture. But in terms of Torah, I think it's a very, very important section. Oh, by the way, in the Philadelphia area, we have not one, but there are 2 laboratories for studying linen and wool. It's called Shatnez Laboratory. And let's say I buy a tie, I can't always tell exactly what's in there. But if I send the tie to these guys, they do that analysis. This is for Orthodox people in general. But just quickly, this is what it means to me. 20 million years ago, there were no human beings. There were plenty of apes and gorillas. And apes and gorillas have 24 chromosomes. We have 23. And if you look at chromosome number 2, you will see it has 2 centromeres, and you can see the structure of it, that 2 chromosomes were joined together end to end. You can clearly see it if you study the DNA. And to me, it's an admonition for us. Don't start experimenting with chimeric creatures. Don't try to grow some stem cells from a human embryo, and we're going to do this and do that, and it'll be part pig, part human. No, no, no. Okay, because you're messing with something that goes against creation itself.
The original GMO.
Very similar. Yeah.
So no mules, right? Mule is a donkey and horse hybrid.
Mule is okay because mules are sterile. In other words, you cannot take you can put 50 mules in a dark room, put on some soft music, serve them some wine. You'll still only have 50 mules.
But it doesn't say like don't create new self-perpetuating breeds of animals. It says do not let your animals, I mean cattle, it says cattle in the English, which we think of as like specifically cows, but like behemoth just means like any kind of domesticated, farm animal. It says do not let them breed with other things. So why would a horse and a donkey be allowed to breed together in the first place?
I don't know, but
I'm sure the rabbis can like explain it somewhere. I've not come across that responsa or that explanation of halakha.
I'll give you the reform answer that I'm making up as I go along. It's this. Last time I was in Morocco, I noticed they were plowing fields with a horse and a donkey, or a bull and a donkey. And I said, oh my God, this violates Shatnez. We're not allowed to do this. What is the reason? And the reason why people tend to do this is the horse pulls faster. So he forces the donkey to move along. The donkey pulls stronger. So he forces the horse to pull harder. Now, I thought about that over many years, and I said, the message to me is this: when I assign work assignments at work, I have to remember not to yoke together 2 secretaries who work in opposite ways. In other words, it's just common knowledge. You want to get more production, you yoke them so that one forces the other, and it's just not a kind thing to do. And I've kind of listened to myself over the years. Okay, that's my reform interpretation.
Okay. By the way, Joel, I don't know where in Philly you are, but I wonder if you've ever checked out South Philadelphia's Stiebel.
Yes, I know all about it.
Okay.
It's what we call open Orthodox.
Yeah,
And
Dossie is a friend of mine, so I don't know. It just seemed like something that might be
okay, who's your friend?
Dossie, the rabbi or rabbah, or I don't know which label she's using these days.
Maharit. I'm trying to remember her name.
Fruchter.
Doctor, yes.
Yes.
By the way, her grandfather was a very religious person living down in Tennessee, and their upstairs neighbor was Elvis Presley. So they'd have to call Elvis Presley in to light the Shabbos candle to, whatever, take care of, and this is all
I
fact.
have heard that Elvis was a Shabbos goy. I don't think I ever heard from Dossie that it was for her grandfather's family.
Yes, I will send you the documentation for it.
Oh, that's funny.
And
Anyway, I join their Dafyomi sessions via Zoom sometimes, and it's a level of study. I don't know what word to use, but a level of intellectual interest in Jewish text that you might appreciate. To Lamar's question, should the same apply to the mixing of races, bloods, and religions? Now, unfortunately, in history, I think it has been used that way, that this text has been used to promote anti-miscegenation laws and things like that. Obviously, I don't believe that. All of these things that it talks about are not people. People are not cattle or fabrics, like that's not how human emotions work. And so I don't think that holds, but certainly it has been used that way in
And
history.
for what it's worth, the genetics of different races is not
Right.
anything
Yeah.
near they're not different.
Right.
We are not different.
Right. Exactly. And religions is a different ballgame too, because that's more of a social construct anyway. And so the idea of whether or not to mix religions gets more complicated in issues like, the social structure around it. If it's a pluralistic culture to begin with or not, if the religions are mainly kept separate, for whatever reasons. Like I would say in Israel, for example, it's not like this piece of Torah is used to justify like some divine law of keeping people separated. But because so much of domestic law is operated by religious courts, it makes it almost impossible for people of different religions to get married, because only the ultra-Orthodox can perform legal marriages in Israel. Only, certain types of Christian religious authorities are authorized to perform legal marriages in Israel. And the same thing with certain Muslim. I know less about the structure of legal, or of the breakdowns of imams. So I don't know exactly how that works, but again, only religious authorities recognized by the state can perform legal marriages in Israel. And so if that authority doesn't do intermarriage, or only does apparently it's easier. The ultra-Orthodox rabbis will really not do any interfaith marriages. Apparently some Muslim and Christian religious authorities will marry a Muslim or Christian man. Like they will do an interfaith marriage as long as the man is their religion. So it's not completely impossible, but it's functionally impossible. Now, of course, couples, interfaith couples, gay couples, secular couples who just don't want that kind of wedding ceremony, they often go to Cyprus and get married there. And then the marriage license is still recognized in Israel. They are still considered legally married, but you can't get there's no secular marriage. There's no justice of the peace in Israel. So things like that, like that's a whole other ball game. But that's not related to this piece of Torah, but it's it also happens. Joel, I'm not sure I 100% I mean, I can explain the difference between Torah Judaism and Rabbinic Judaism, but is there something specific that I said that blurred those lines that you want me to clarify?
Just for Lamar, in Torah, there's absolutely no word for religion. Doesn't exist.
Okay, right. So, right, that's what I mean by it's so much more contextual on the society about the mixing of religions. Certainly in the Torah, there is mixing of right. I mean, that's also an anachronism for the Torah. They didn't have that concept, but we have Moses is an Israelite and he marries Zipporah, a Midianite. We have, I don't know, I can't think of other examples. Ruth is a Moabite. Not only is she not Israelite, but she's of this other nation that's supposed to be completely off limits, but she is accepted in. She marries Boaz and becomes the grandmother, Perez, Jesse, great grandmother to King David. So, it happens all the time in Torah. So yes, there is definitely that distinction. Okay. Is it okay if we move on to Brandy's question on Molech? Okay. So Molech is or Moloch, sometimes it's spelled with an O, a second O, is a ancient Near Eastern deity. I would say God more than demon, but he is terrifying. Like he's not a benevolent God or a creator God. He's a monstrous fire god that eats children. I'm sure in his context there was also a positive side of him. Like Kali is the destruction goddess in Hinduism, but she also is a creation goddess in some ways. So I'm sure Moloch had multifaceted sides of him, but in the text that survived about him, it's just pure terror. Allen Ginsberg's poem Howl, has a lot of references to Moloch as well. So there's a lot of pieces in Torah in general that are Jews or Israelites at the time do not do this because your neighbors do this and you are not your neighbors. And so some of the stuff with Moloch is in this parsha is sort of that, but also because Moloch in particular was such a terrifying god that demanded the blood of children. And so, don't sacrifice your children in fire. Seems like a good rule of thumb. And can one marry a Torah scroll? No, you can only marry humans in Judaism. And Judaism is not an ascetic or celibate. There's not really a monastic line of Judaism. I assume this is what you mean by marry a Torah scroll, like nuns marry Jesus or whatever. There's no equivalent in Judaism. It is a mitzvah to get married have children, like have a family, find love with a fellow consenting adult. So yeah. Joel, they have built the high places of Tophet, which is in the valley of the son of Hinnom, Gehinnom, to burn their sons and their daughters in the fire, which I commanded not, neither it came into my mind. Right. So, yeah, you see that kind of stuff a lot. Gehinnom or Gehenna or whatever. There's several English variations of how we pronounce that word. Becomes sort of a stand-in for hell in Judaism because it was a physical place in Israel. It was a valley that was already naturally hot and dry based on its geography, but then it also in various times in history was an altar for Molech where people were burned alive, and it was the dump for Jerusalem where trash was burned. So it was hot, it was stinky, it was scary, it was a horrifying place for anyone to have to go to. And I'll tell you, I've never been to a place where human sacrifices were done, but I did once have to drive a trash van for camp and often also clean up after what we called the bear mitzvahs, where the bears would get into the dumpsters and eat whatever edible things left they could find, and then leave the plastic and their droppings all over the area. And like a place set aside specifically for garbage is not a place you want to be ever. It's gross. So I can only imagine how much more disgusting and horrifying Gehenna was. So that's why it becomes a stand-in for hell. Chava, I have no idea what this is, what your last comment means. I don't know who the round bearded one is.
Oh, it references that someplace in the portion, but I don't remember where.
It mentions someone marrying a Torah scroll.
No, it mentions the hair, not cutting the hair and the
Yeah.
round beard.
Oh,
and
yeah,
rounding the
yeah.
beard off.
That's okay. So, yeah, okay. The beard thing is, again, I don't know what Chava is talking about. Round bearded one is not I don't know who
Okay.
that is, and there
Our
is no Jewish
translation-
Mashiach.
Okay, it's the
But
26th.
But yeah, the beard, you shall not cut your beards. It's in 19, right? It's like near the
It's 26, it's 1927, and and our translation says,
you shall not round off.
round off the side growth on your head.
Right. It means like don't trim your beard or cut your payas, or shave, or that you should leave the corners. It's related to leave the corners of your face and the tzitzi and everything as reminders to leave the corners of your field fallow so that the poor may come and eat. And here it's just it's in this list of things that serve as reminders of do not defile your body. So just let your hair grow. Yeah, Chava, please explain.
Yes. So as I was YouTubing Jewish history, there was a group of people at one point of time, and I think they may not have been the only ones, but they thought someone was the Mashiach. And this person was said to have married a Torah scroll twice and then got married. But it's far back in Jewish history is what this YouTube video started. But
Yeah,
I
that
was
doesn't help
just
me.
piggybacking on the.
There have been several false messiahs in Jewish history. I mean, around the time of Jesus, there was like 4 other Galileans, like within that same, I mean, not within his same lifetime, but like within that era of Roman oppression. There were like 4 other people who had almost this like an identical profile of like poor manual laborers from the Galilee, you know, that went around claiming to be the Messiah. Then there's Shabbatai Tzvi in, I want to say 16th century. I can't remember off the top of my head his time
I
period.
think it was Shabbatai Tzvi.
Yeah, so that's, I mean, you know, it's relatively modern for Jewish history. He claimed to be the Messiah, and then the caliphate caught him. It was during a time of Jews living under Muslim rule. The caliphate caught him and, you know, told him convert to Islam or die. And he converted to Islam, which I think, like, what a betrayal for your Messiah to completely abandon you and your faith. And then there was an offshoot of the Shabbataians called the Frankians. I don't know as much about that history. They were even smaller population and short-lived. But Frank was a disciple of Shabbatai Tzvi. And so after he converted, Frank, or again, it probably was pronounced Frank, I don't know. He like took up the mantle, and I don't know that he declared himself Messiah in Shabbatai Tzvi's place, but he like became the religious leader of that cult. But I don't know about yeah, I don't know about, is this, so 17th century, that would still be that same, is this still about Shabbatai Tzvi, Joel? Who married a Torah scroll? I don't know that story, I don't think.
Sure, it's hard to track down.
Okay.
But
But the point is that it was not. It never caught mainstream. It was this cult.
No, that's not a
thing.
normal thing. Okay. I mean, and you know, again, to bring it back to Torah, we have a whole list of relationships that are not allowed in the Torah, in this parsha. And I think like the main rule of thumb is this person a fellow consenting adult human who does not share, who is not related to you? I was gonna say share your blood, but there's also things about like even relatives through marriage, because it makes the whole family weird, you know? If you sleep with your stepmom, like you don't have to worry about genetic issues with the potential children, but that still makes Thanksgiving weird. So don't do that.
The
Yes.
line in here about, it's 18, do not marry a woman as a rival to her sister. I mean, is that because of how unhappy Leah supposedly was at times, or it just is there?
I think that's a good
There's no way.
interpretation. Yeah. I mean, I don't know that we have a definitive reason for that.
Well, I know
think-
not in the Torah, but has it been discussed in other places that?
Yeah. Well, so Ibn Ezra says that this is a reference to that. But some of the other ones just say, the other commentaries just say like just, again, like it makes things weird, you know, if you have, if you divorce, so it's not just about having two wives or whatever, but if you divorce one and marry her sister, but then again, like think about the next family gathering that you all still have to be together. Don't do that. Yeah, don't do anything that's gonna like mess up the whole family dynamic is sort of I think a good rule of thumb. Maybe within, I mean, I don't know, I guess there are families that are homophobic or racist that might make it hard for you to bring home an otherwise acceptable partner that could throw off the family dynamic, but you know, it's not the same.
When Reform Judaism first became officially accepting of homosexual relationships,
Yeah.
how did they, and I'm certainly not arguing with them, yay for them for doing it, but how did they justify it against all the very specific things in the Torah against it?
That's a good question. I mean, partly it was like a lot of things in Reform Judaism. It just was a matter of keeping up with the times. So you see in a lot of the responsa, you might remember we looked at some of these specifically or last
That's right.
summer when we did it, that like it starts with sort of begrudging acceptance, right? Like these families are already in our congregations and we did not perform their marriages, their commitment ceremonies. We do not you know, accept them, but we still want their children to be allowed to have bar and bat mitzvahs. So how do we navigate that? You know, so it starts pretty begrudging and just like, you know, adapting to society, because that's a huge facet of Reform Judaism, is being able to adapt with modern norms, which whatever modern is at the time, or contemporary, I should say. And so then when they do release the responsa that like officially says, okay, now Reform rabbis are empowered to perform same-sex commitment ceremonies and eventually weddings, and we are ordaining LGBTQ rabbis and things like that. You know, this is where my joke, Reform Judaism just slaps a B'Tselem Elohim on anything, on any justice issue. And, you know, that it's like all people are created in the divine image and we accept people's identities and, you know, and that's it. The conservative movement had more trouble with it, right? Because they also, you know, they saw what was happening. It was starting to creep into their congregations anyway, but they are a more halachically grounded movement. And so they had to have like more intentional processes with their responsa committee to come up with like you know, more halachically grounded reasons to accept it. And I don't remember offhand, I have read the Teshuvah, I don't remember offhand what their reasoning is. It is more in depth than every person is committed in the image of God. Like they actually do pull other Talmudic quotes and things like that. So that's, you know, it took them an extra 10, 20 years. You know, so.
But they did.
But they did. Yes, they did. And now open Orthodoxy is going to do this, have the same problem. They have, you know, they have folks in their schools who are accepted as out LGBT people, but then they're not ordained. You can only learn with us. You can't represent us as a rabbi. But it's like a matter of time then, as long as you're acknowledging those students at all, like it's only a matter of time before that yeshiva starts ordaining them too, you know? Yes, Joel?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that with modernity, we face this issue every day, don't we?
Yeah.
As things come up in the news, I'm saying to myself, where do I stand on this? And answering what Lamar asked before, one of the things I'm very grateful for is it's not just my opinion, but I can dig back through history and I can say, what did these sages have to say about this? And of course, they're quoting the Torah and the Talmud, and this is gold for me. I'll give you one quick example. Today in the Orthodox community, when it comes to Shabbat, they are not allowed to tear toilet paper. What that means is on Friday, you're going to rip off 100 sheets, 200 sheets, whatever you think you need. Because if you run out, you run out. And I even read one article and they were kind of alluding to the fact that, well, you just got to keep unrolling the roll and unrolling and unrolling. And, you know, God knows your toilet will get clogged up. And then I started to think, wait a minute, a year ago, I was wondering, can I even find toilet paper? So now you have to get into a lot of complex things. Of course, most of us don't mind ripping toilet paper. It's just a small issue, but for some people, very important. Isn't that true today in the world? And I don't like modernity. I don't like people saying, I'm going to make up my own rules, because in my own lifetime, I lived through the Holocaust. I have a lot of people that I know who were in danger of losing their lives. And I have a lot of people I know who were given over to Moloch. They were burned up. Okay. So I think that's why it's important for us to stand on our history and at least be aware, certainly for our institutions. Okay. Now, maybe we're all backsliders, all of us. Like we don't do things perfectly. Maybe we'll improve, maybe we won't. But the idea is, how do we make this okay in our own heads? So anyway, that's my story about Orthodox Reform. I tend not to listen. I don't care if someone's Reform or no. We're all people. We're just people, and we judge each other on what we do. By the way, the Torah. Even the language itself, I always see the verb first, and then I see the subject second. The message is it's what we do that's important. It's not who we think we are.
That's a Josh that Ibn Ezra would be very proud of. I want to shift to Lamar's comment in the chat with our last 10 minutes. I mean, it's a real, like, that's a very good question, series of questions, whatever. I mean, it's difficult, and the Torah is very anthropomorphic about God. So when it says you shall be holy for I the Lord your God am holy, and like this is what it means to be godlike, that's complicated with how theology has evolved. So Maimonides coins this idea of negative theology, I believe is how he phrases it. So it's that you cannot conceptualize God, you can only know what God is not. And then he has a list of things like God has no body, God has no time, God has no mortality, these things. And then he wrote the Guide for the Perplexed, which is it's like this thick, it's ginormous. And it basically goes through the whole Torah it's a series of Divrei Torah almost. I mean, they don't read easily like a book of sermons might, but more or less that's what it is, where he goes through and comments on every instance in the Torah where an anthropomorphic descriptor of God is used, you know, when it says God's anger, God's hand, God smelled, God, whatever, all of those, like anything that insinuates that God has a body or human emotions or whatever, which the Torah does a lot. And with the body stuff, it might be easy to say it's metaphoric or God appears as we can conceptualize God or whatever. But the emotion stuff is hard to just write off because God acts on those emotions. You know, God is angry and then the earth opens up and swallows people. So like, it's kind of hard to read that as metaphoric, but Maimonides does it. He goes through like every instance of such a thing, of such anthropomorphic descriptors of God, and explains how it's a metaphor, what it truly comes to teach us. And so it's not an easy undertaking to read that, but through that basis, then Judaism has really built on those concepts of like, what does it mean to be God-like as humans when, like, you know, we exist on completely separate realities, basically. And I mean, the short answer is, you know, by doing what the Torah says, you know, as much as we can, like by identifying the divine spark in every other person, by pursuing justice, by you know, living a good life, being fruitful and multiplying. You know, whatever it is, finding love, you know, these things make us holy. Yeah, Debbie.
Just along those lines, a lot of we've talked about the things in verse 19 and 18 that give us trouble, but there's so many things here that, you know, as we've been reading through the Torah and we come to instances where God theoretically says, kill everybody in the village, the children, the donkeys, everybody else, they give us modern people trouble. But then you come to lines like, you know, like don't put a stumbling block in front of a blind person, or treat the stranger, don't wrong the stranger because you were a stranger in Egypt. And you all those take over and wipe out the other ones for me. And that to me is maybe following those is how to be godlike if you can, as often as you can.
Yeah, I agree. And that's, you know, that's why we're also studying Midrash right now in our Sunday classes, because, right, like how do those two pieces of instruction live side by side, right? How do we interpret that when sometimes God tells us to commit genocide and sometimes God tells us to love everybody equally? Like that, those feel like incompatible instructions. So that's why we need drash. We need to be able to interpret for ourselves. God's withdrawal, that's a very particular theology. I don't know that I would say that's mainstream, but certainly the idea of Ein Sof helps us understand that there are many facets to God and many ways to relate and to understand God and what it means to be holy. And the Ein Sof concept encompasses them all, that God is limitless, and you know, and all of these realities exist within When I was a teenager, a young teenager, my friends and I were really into the Mists of Avalon, which, like, in retrospect, there's a lot of problems with that book. Since Marion Zimmerman's death, Mary Zimmer, whatever her name is, Marion Zimmer. Since her death, a lot of allegations have come out about abuse and things, that she, like, wasn't a good person. So, I have to put that caveat. But as a kid, something I really loved about it is that the main character, or the women of Avalon in general, that it's not always the same woman that says this, but that all the gods are one god and all the goddesses one goddess, and that we are all one. And that, this idea that, like, Ein Sof incorporates all, and however any person understands their own theology and their own pathway to a divine life, that's their own way, and we can call God different things, but it's all the same energy of the universe, essentially. And so that's something that, that sticks with me 20 years later. So that is our Torah study today. A reminder that Sunday at 1, we do have our next Midrash class. And Sunday at 6, we are doing Pesach Sheni. And I'm so excited to see people in person. So I hope those of you that are local, sorry, Joel, will join us. So long, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.